So, in our Regenerate series of conversations, of interviews, what unites all the people we've spoken to, from Mimi Castile in Oregon, the lady who makes wine, to Joel Salatin on the East Coast, to Isabella Tree in England, the rewilding expert, to David Bronner, the CEO of Bronner Soaps, to Frederick Laloux, the theorist of regeneration. It occurs to me that they're all regenerators, that they are all regenerative leaders. So who better to talk to today than an expert both on regenerators and on regenerative leadership? Laura Storm is the Danish, but now Portugal-based founder of regenerators.co and the co-author of Regenerative Leadership. Laura, what is a regenerator?
A regenerator is a person, an individual that goes through life thinking about adding more value that one takes. So a person that reflects around what kind of groceries he or she buys in the supermarket and where it comes from. A person who reflects around how they show up in the workspace, how they treat their employees, their co-workers, their family. It's an individual who thinks about being part of a greater interconnected web of life that is on this planet, and that for the Homo sapiens to stick around for longer time that it looks like we are heading towards right now. It's someone who thinks about, how can I add value to the ecosystem I'm a part of?
Laura, there seems to be something of a paradox about regenerative leadership, because my interpretation of your work and the work of others is that the whole premise of regenerative leadership is that we shouldn't be top-down leaders, and yet there still is the idea or ideal of regenerative leadership. Is that paradox accurate?
For me, and for regenerative leadership and that term, and what Giles Hutchins and I have written about in the book, we see leadership on all levels. It's not just about the CEO or the line manager showing leadership. It's every individual that shows leadership. We are all part of the same kind of spaceship Earth, and we need to take our own radical leadership. And leadership is not necessarily something that is taken from the top down. We teach leaders what we call an ecosystemic mindset. Leaders need to understand how they can become ecosystem facilitators. So instead of having that view where you are kind of dictating orders and having a very clear idea of how the strategy needs to be rolled out, you are taking a step back and sensing into the system, your organization that you are a part of, and you have an outstanding ability of sensing into where is the stagnated energy, where can I unleash more potential, where can I empower more people to do more good, and how can we revitalize this system of the organization? How can we bring more energy and life into it instead of this very fear-based mechanistic mindset of the 20th century, where it was very few within the organization that had all the answers, and you better follow the order from your leader, or else it was you were shown the door. So regenerative leadership is a completely different way of viewing leadership.
So it's a kind of democratized form of leadership. All of us can lead each other, and we can also lead ourselves. Is that fair?
I wouldn't use the word democracy. I would rather use the word empowered leadership, that it's a form of leadership that is taking everyone seriously, that is tapping into the collective intelligence of the organization. It doesn't mean that everyone have the same say. There is still people appointed to make the decisions. But the leaders that we are in touch with, those that we call regenerative leaders, they are tapping into the potential and into the intelligence of the organization, and not just making kind of tunnel view decisions for the greater good of the organizations. But it's not democracy. There are still a few people within the organization that have a bigger say than others.
You've said in various speeches and in your writing that you learned some of the logic of regenerative leadership and regenerators.co from nature itself. Well, what do you mean by that?
I mean that we on this planet are part of a greater logic of life, a logic that we have kind of turned our back against, but a logic that all life on this planet is based upon. So if we zoom in on that intelligence and narrow it down, it's based on a few very simple principles, really. So life on this planet thrives thanks to diversity, thanks to the ability of building really strong relationships. The species that have been around here for the longest are the species, both within the animal and the plant kingdom, that have been the best at cultivating and nourishing really rich relationships. So in fact, Darwin is translated in a very wrong way. He never said survival of the fittest as in the strongest, the most alpha male. But the survival of the species best able to fit in, and fitting in happened thanks to very strong relationships. Life also thrives thanks to an honoring of a cyclical and rhythmical process, an understanding of the fact that for life to thrive, it needs to go through seasons. But we, the Homo sapiens, are going through life as in everything has to be a constant spring and summer. So how can we as regenerative leaders step back and cultivate a seasonal approach in everything that we do? Meaning that we need space to integrate the learnings, we need space to stop and reflect. And we need to embrace the regenerative capacity of the long winter. Life also thrive thanks to a very responsive approach. And that is something that we have seen here during the COVID-19 pandemic. The companies and organizations that are thriving are those that have a very agile and nimble way of organizing their cooperation. And that is the same for regenerative leaders. In the very kind of rigid mechanistic hierarchy, it's very difficult to make rapid decisions. You need an organization that is designed as a living system, meaning that every kind of cell in the organism is tapped in and tuned on and is understanding its role in the bigger picture and is empowered and is understanding that it's important that I do my role the best as I possibly can and that I have a great deal of responsibility. So the organization that are designed as a living system have proved that they have the right organizational design in terms of how can they cope with pandemics like the one that we are in the midst of right now. Whereas those with a very mechanistic mindset are simply acting too slowly. And they are geared in a way where regenerative organizations have learned to design everything, their purchases and everything, to be not just in time, but just in case. As one of my partners, Jenny Anderson, is educating and teaching us about. I don't know if any of this makes sense, but let me know if you want me to expand.
No, it makes a lot of sense, Laura. I love your allusion to Charles Darwin. Darwin, of course, famously wrote about the survival of the fittest. And as you suggest, that's been misinterpreted. You're suggesting then that it's the survival, the reality of the natural world is it's a survival of the most regenerative. Is that what really Darwin was trying to suggest, or at least what you're saying?
Yes, I guess both. That was what he was suggesting, and also what I have based kind of my teachings on, and what other regenerative pioneers in this space is saying, that the species that want to stick around for the longer run, they need to take themselves out of the equation, not focus on the I, but focus on the we. How can we stick around? And what is my role and what is my contribution in this greater web of life?
In your work, Laura, you've acknowledged that the logic for your theories of regeneration have been borrowed from nature. Why is nature so essential in your thinking?
We are nature. We are part of nature. But the thing is, human beings have just separated and disconnected ourselves completely from nature. We have spent 99% of the time we have been around as a species completely in tune with nature, constantly sensing into our environment, being part of nature, worshiping nature. Our gods have been images of nature. But within the past 500 years, we have separated ourselves more and more from nature. And today, most of us spend the majority of our lives in concrete buildings under artificial daylight. We may go there in a car. We have very little access to our natural habitat. And I believe that that is part of what is making us very sick at the moment. We have never suffered more from anxiety, depression. Suicide rates have never been higher than they are today. And I mean that a great part to that is attributed our disconnection from our natural habitat. What would we think about chimpanzees if we kind of serve them the same kind of lifestyle that the majority of people are living? So I think nature really has all the answers that we need to go back to. And I don't mean that we are then that we should go out in nature and live in huts. Maybe some of us would love that. But that's not my suggestion. My suggestion is to humbly and with honor look at how nature has designed civilizations, how they have designed superorganisms. In many ways, human beings is a superorganism. So what can we learn from nature when we redesign our cities and societies? How could we build cities that are mimicking a forest? Where it felt like walking around in a forest. We actually have all the tools available. It's at our hands. Electric vehicles and another way of electrifying, getting our electricity. We know how to grow food differently. We know the importance of being surrounded by nature and plants. We know from studies that for example, there's a study done 12 years ago on how quickly patients were recovering after a surgery, and patients are recovering much quicker when they have access to nature outside the window. By looking at nature from the hospital bed, they recover much more quickly. So how can we start to think about nature as the design guide for the next step of our civilization, instead of looking at nature as something that we may visit on a Sunday afternoon? But it's actually something that is a part of us. And that is what I'm advocating, that we need to go back with the intelligence we have today, with the solutions and technologies we have at our hands. We need to go back and reconnect ourselves with the intelligence that is around us.
I'm particularly intrigued with your idea of regenerating cities by turning them into forests without, of course, going back, as you suggested, to living in huts. How do we do that? How can cities, 21st century cities, become like forests? How can we learn from nature to transform our cities?
So, I mean, regenerative architecture is already a field that is gaining more and more interest. And they are getting more and more advanced as to how can our buildings mimic nature? What can we learn from termites, for example, that are building fascinating structures in sub-Saharan countries? How can we learn from those in the structure and design of houses in sub-Saharan countries, just to give an example? That is what some architects have done. How can our buildings mimic what nature would do in the place-based kind of species that are living in that climate region that we want to create a city in. But we have the abilities to purify water and turn sunlight into energy. We have the abilities and the technologies so that our vehicles could be powered by the sun. We have all the technologies and solutions to replace our current building blocks in cities with regenerative solutions, so that the noise level could go down and we could again hear the birds. We could plant more trees. We could be very mindful and careful around our water consumption and how we use our water. We know how to grow for food in cities. We can bring back the power to the citizens, create more spaces where they can grow their own foods. There are various ways for empowering people to regenerate their lives, and we have all the solutions. It's about connecting the dots, putting the pieces together, and thankfully more and more scientists and pioneers are trailblazing that area. Janine Benyus is a fascinating thinker within biomimicry, and she is currently helping the global carpet company Interface completely mimicking forest for all their factories. So all their factories has to mimic forests by purifying water and turn sunlight into energy using regenerative materials. It has to feel like walking around in a forest when you enter their factories. So more and more examples are coming up, and we need to learn from them and integrate those learnings in redesigning cities for the 21st century.
What about the product itself? If the factories mimic nature, a carpet factory, what does the carpet itself look like? I assume it's not a typically industrially produced carpet.
No, exactly. There are many carpet companies that are performing like Interface. We have a few Danish companies as well, but part of their portfolios is carpets that can purify the air. Where you buy, as a company, you buy a service. So if you have a carpet tile that is broken, you get that repaired. The carpets can be recycled and go into the cycle of life again by being upcycled or recycled. The materials are very rarely virgin material. Interface is getting a lot of their materials from, for example, a partnership with Vietnamese fishermen, where they are paying them to fish up discarded fish nets that are just lying around in the oceans. Plastic waste in our oceans is one of our major big problems of the 21st century. We soon have more plastic in our ocean than marine life. So Interface is really taking a leadership position there, paying fishermen to fish plastic from the ocean. They're using that old discarded fish net to produce their carpet tiles. So it's about viewing your organization, the input in terms of materials, the output in terms of your products, but also your stakeholders and your partners as one big ecosystem. And how can you be a regenerative ecosystem facilitator? By thinking about how you can help transform every system that you interact with. So for example, those fishermen are now getting paid a decent salary to help be part of the solution. And how could more and more companies have that mindset? Interface is one of the most profitable carpet companies in the world, and they have only been more profitable since they made the decision a few decades ago to be fully regenerative. So this is a business model as well, and this is not philanthropy. Which is important for me to say, because some companies believe that sustainability and regenerative thinking is for hippies, but that's really not the truth. It's the recipe for our survival.
Laura, you mentioned earlier that a lot of companies and individuals are reinventing themselves or revising their lives in 2020 because of the COVID crisis. I know that you and your family have moved from Copenhagen to a regenerative farm in Portugal, in part, I think, because of the COVID-19 crisis. Where in Portugal have you resettled your family?
We are in central Portugal, outside of a city called little city town called Tomar. And we are living on a permaculture farm, growing our own food and homeschooling our children. So yeah, we took a radical decision during this pandemic of seizing the opportunity and doing something completely different. We found ourselves trapped in an apartment in the city of Copenhagen when the pandemic hit, and promised ourselves never to go through that again. Homeschooling your kids inside a tiny city apartment is not the success for a thriving life. Let me be completely honest. So we crave more access to nature and growing our own food and living a more regenerative life from beginning to end in a way.
How has this experience on the regenerative farm in central Portugal, how has it changed your view of the soil?
That's such a good question. I mean, I have studied nature for such a long time and studied soil as well, but it's completely different when you are immersing your hands in earth and have to grow vegetables from the soil. And the importance of really nutrient and delicious topsoil is critical, or else your vegetables won't grow, or they will taste terrible. So having that balance and kind of being an ecosystem facilitator through your own little ecosystem that we have here has been, I mean, crucial. So my partner is doing his best to establish a hot compost system. So all the manure from the donkeys are put in one place, and then we are bringing out the chickens and the ducks, and we are throwing our vegetable compost on it. So it's a combination of black and green compost. And already within 10 days, it has started to produce really, really delicious soil. But the beautiful thing is that that was done in a rich collaboration between the stakeholders living on this little ecosystem. And thanks to that really delicious soil, it will be much more easy for us to grow delicious vegetables that we can live off. The soil here in central Portugal is incredibly hard and tough because the sunlight is excruciating at this time of the year. And during the winters, it rains a lot. So the earth gets very, very hot and very dry. So the ability of cultivating rich soil has never been more important hands-on than it is right now. But I mean, you can take that lesson and incorporate that into every organization, into every community. The importance of the soil in our organizations for our employees to bloom, for our students to bloom in schools and in the education system is so incredibly important. What is the environment that we grow up in is everything. So soil is very important.
Do you think it might be helpful if every leader of a regenerative organization, or anyone who was interested in the idea of regeneration, should spend some time on a regenerative farm? The experience with the soil, it seems so meaningful for you and many others.
Yes, and it's not a coincidence that many times that me and my partners facilitate leadership retreats out in nature. It's often done at retreats that have a permaculture farm on site, so that we can incorporate those learnings when we immerse ourselves with leaders. And the epiphanies and the insight that these leaders get when they are immersed in nature is, I mean, you can't compare that to anything. We need to get leaders out of boring and dreadful corporate environments when they are rethinking the redesign of their organizations. It's just so incredibly important to see leaders change over the course of a few days. They get a glimpse in their eyes, they reconnect with their hearts. And for regenerative leadership, that element is incredibly important as well, because nature's learnings is one thing and it's paramount, but the importance of us cultivating a deep connection to our inner nature is equally important. And that is really what has been missing from our society. We have not been taught how to cultivate a rich connection to our inner landscape, to our inner nature. So that is also something that leaders need to kind of unschool or relearn themselves. How do they stand stronger in themselves? And I'm not talking here about a 10-step self-awareness manual or self-leadership. It's about a radically different level of consciousness, that level of consciousness that arises when we immerse ourselves in nature and suddenly see ourselves from the outside, our organization from the outside, and see that we really truly are a part of a greater interconnected web of life. And for us to steer the spaceship Earth on a regenerative direction, we need to play a radically different role in that web of life for us to be here in the longer run.
You've spoken about these radical epiphanies that corporate types experience when they come to one of your retreats, one of your regenerative retreats on the soil. When do these epiphanies tend to happen? Is it when a corporate leader is drinking a cup of tea and looking out over the fields, or is it when they bend over and put their hands in the soil?
It's a combination. And of course, we design these learning experiences to be a combination of us delivering hopefully insightful learnings, but also to make sure there's a lot of space for being solo in nature. So we send them out on their own in nature for often many hours at a time to spend time in silence and to spend time with themselves. And we hear again and again, I mean, and we're talking plus 60 really powerful CEOs coming back with tears in their eyes. And when they are sharing their experience, it's often one of, I cannot believe I have not kind of spent time with myself for the past 20 years. I cannot believe that what kind of thinking that started to emerge once I just allowed silence to take over. And I'm not just talking about a silent retreat or meditation. I'm talking about that when you are creating the right space for leaders, to have them think about their legacy, to have them think about what is their connection to nature, how is their corporation delivering or contributing to their grandchildren being allowed to stay here for the longer run. And then the reflections that start to come when they sit by a tree overlooking the forest and contemplating what is really and truly my legacy. It's rich and powerful stuff. And there's often a lot of tears because they're meeting themselves for the first time in many ways, in a new way at least.
You're presenting it almost as a religious epiphany. Is there a metaphysical quality to this experience?
Is there what, sorry?
A religious quality, a metaphysical quality to this experience?
I mean, I'm not religious myself. I don't really like being taught kind of certain dogma, but I think for some, it may have a religious flavor to it in the sense that the kind of religious traditions that we have had for the majority of the time we have been here as a species has been one of seeing God, whatever God is, in everything, in every plant, in every animal, in yourself, in every kind of living thing. God is present. But that is not a religious mindset that we have been taught for the past many centuries. We've been taught that God is someone judging you from above. And in a way, I think for many, it is more an experience of meeting something that's bigger than yourselves. We never teach anything remotely religious, but there is something grand about meeting yourself alone for the first time in nature.
Laura, you mentioned that you not only moved yourself and your partner, but your kids from Copenhagen to central Portugal. And you've talked a lot about education. Do you think, and particularly in the COVID crisis, there's more and more debate about how we should reinvent education, not only in 2020, but in the 21st century. How essential do you think the soil should be in educating children about their responsibilities, challenges, and opportunities in the 21st century?
In many ways, it's the most important thing we can teach our children. And I don't mean just soil in the physical sense of soil. That is incredibly important. And that they have that understanding, where is my food coming from and what can I do to help nourish the soil upon which my life is dependent. But it's also about viewing soil in the bigger picture. How can I help cultivate nourishing environments wherever I am? Maybe that's one of the most important lessons we have mistakenly not taught our kids for a very, very long time. We are teaching our kids to compete, to win, to succeed within a very narrow frame. And we have no idea about how, for example, how nature works. What is the logic of life? And how does living systems in nature thrive? And to what extent are Homo sapiens just another superorganism living in nature on this planet? I mean, we are not teaching our kids anything in that area. But yes, soil is incredibly important, and so many things can be embedded and taught within the framework of soil and cultivating healthy, nourishing soil.
A couple of weeks ago, I spent some time with some friends who had a 2-year-old, and the whole time we were sitting in their garden, and the whole time the 2-year-old was playing in the dirt, and they told us that's all he likes to do. Do you think there's something about children in their innocence and wisdom that makes them appreciate the soil more than grown-ups? And perhaps the challenge then with grown-ups is returning them to childhood, to the simple challenges and pleasures of childhood.
Oh yes, there's definitely a lot to that. And I live on a farm myself now with my 7-year-old and my just turned 1-year-old. So he is still a baby. But he walks around and everything, he takes everything into his mouth and is just kind of exploring and investigating. And the same with my 7-year-old daughter. She is exploring and adventuring around the land in a way where already, I mean, we have only been here for 2 months, but she's already kind of showing up differently. She has a lot more kind of courage, and she just acts differently. She climbs trees in a way she was never able to in the city, and takes care of the donkeys. And we just had ducklings a few weeks ago. She helps take care of those, and just that kind of ability to nurture life. And have an understanding of the cycle of life from a very early age. We had a few ducklings that died, which was sad, but it's part of life, it's part of nature. But we are a civilization who fears death more than anything, but death is a part of life. So how can we teach our kids about that part of the cycle without us being afraid of it? But there's a beauty to a natural cycle of life. So nature presents itself with so many lessons and so many teachings, but unfortunately, very few kids have access to that. So it's about teachers, enabling teachers to have that rich material be incorporated into the curriculums of schools all over the world.
Finally, Laurie, you mentioned our unwillingness or our lack of comfort when it comes to thinking about death. You also talked about silence and the value of silence on these retreats and in nature. Is that the acoustic of regeneration, silence? And can that help us prepare and accept death, and also rethink our noisy industrial civilization and really regenerate the world in the 21st century? If only we could embrace the ideal of silence.
Yes, I think you're very spot on there. I think us embracing autumn and winter and not shying away from that, us embracing silence, the inner silence, but also the outer silence. We are so many who are constantly fleeing what comes to the surface when the world goes quiet. We are in many ways taught to fear everything related to death and winter and darkness and silence and solitude. But that is where the golden nuggets of wisdom truly lies. And I think many has been forced to stare their inner demons in the eye during this pandemic. And I hope that is some of the good that can come out of this. That there are golden nuggets of wisdom when we are surrendering to silence. I had to learn myself about silence the very hard way because I suffered a minor traumatic brain injury 5 years ago, and I went from a speedy type A executive position, and from one day to the next, all my abilities were taken away from me. I was not able to read or write or barely speak. I couldn't do anything. So I had to surrender to silence. And although it was painful in the beginning, it really became incredibly healing. And the answers that we can find if we dare look silence into the eye and cultivate more spaces of stillness and silence and reflections into our lives. It's the recipe for us maturing into our next level and into really healthy and regenerative human beings.
And of course, there's nothing more silent than the soil.
True. Beautifully said. And we all need to go back to the soil. And I think that kind of humble attitude to life, that we are all returning to the soil. And while we are alive, how can we, to the best of our abilities, how can we be custodians of the soil, of the planet that we are lucky to be living on during this epochal hour of mankind?